My name is Rebecca Martinez, and I'm 34 years old. As I sat in the mahogany-paneled conference room of Henderson, Walsh and Associates, watching my mother's face drain of all color, I realized that sometimes the people who think they know you best actually know you least of all. The lawyer had just finished reading a portion of my late grandmother's will that changed everything my family believed about me, and the silence in that room was so thick you could have cut it with a knife. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. But let me back up, because the story of how I ended up in that conference room, surrounded by relatives who had spent years looking at me with barely concealed pity, starts much earlier than that Tuesday afternoon in October. Growing up in Sacramento, California, I was always the black sheep of the Martinez family. Not because I was rebellious or troublesome, but because I was different in ways that my mother, Patricia Martinez, never quite understood or approved of. Where she valued appearances and social standing above almost everything else, I valued authenticity and substance. Where she measured success by the size of your house and the brand of your handbag, I measured it by personal fulfillment and genuine happiness. My grandmother, Elena Rodriguez, was my mother's mother, but she might as well have been from a different planet compared to Patricia. Elena had immigrated from Mexico in the 1950s with nothing but determination and a fierce work ethic. She built a small empire from absolutely nothing, starting with a tiny corner grocery store that she expanded into a chain of successful markets throughout Northern California. But Elena was also incredibly private about her wealth, preferring to live modestly and invest wisely rather than flash her success around for everyone to see. Patricia, on the other hand, had married my father, Richard Martinez, a successful real estate developer, and had fully embraced the suburban lifestyle of country club memberships, charity galas, and keeping up with the Joneses. She drove a brand new BMW every 2 years, carried designer purses that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and lived in a sprawling house in one of Sacramento's most exclusive neighborhoods. I, meanwhile, had chosen a completely different path. After graduating from UC Davis with a degree in environmental science, I'd taken a job with a nonprofit organization focused on sustainable agriculture. The work was meaningful to me, but the pay was modest. I lived in a small apartment in Midtown Sacramento, drove a 10-year-old Honda Civic, and shopped at thrift stores not because I thought it was trendy, but because it was what I could afford. On my salary, this difference in our lifestyles became a constant source of tension between my mother and me. Every family gathering became an opportunity for Patricia to make subtle digs about my financial situation. During Christmas dinners, she'd make comments like, "Oh, Rebecca, you really should let me take you shopping for some new clothes. I know money's tight for you right now." At Easter brunch, she'd insist on paying for my meal, loudly announcing to whoever was listening that she wanted to help out her struggling daughter. The worst part wasn't even the comments she made to me directly. It was discovering, through various family members, the things she said about me when I wasn't around. My cousin Sandra told me that Patricia had described me as barely scraping by to the ladies at her book club. My Aunt Carmen mentioned that Patricia had asked her to keep an eye on Rebecca, because she was worried I might need to move back home if I lost my job. What made this particularly frustrating was that Patricia never actually asked me about my financial situation. She simply assumed that because I lived simply and worked for a nonprofit, I must be struggling. She saw my thrift store clothes and my older car and my small apartment, and she created an entire narrative about my life without ever bothering to learn the truth. The truth was far more complicated than she realized. Yes, I worked for a nonprofit, but I'd also been incredibly smart with money from a young age. My grandmother Elena had taught me about investing when I was still in high school, sharing lessons she'd learned from building her business empire. While my college friends were spending their part-time job money on clothes and entertainment, I was putting every spare dollar into index funds and learning about compound interest. By the time I graduated from college, I had already built a solid foundation for my financial future. My modest nonprofit salary was supplemented by dividends from my investments, rental income from a small property I'd purchased using knowledge I'd gained from watching my father's real estate deals, and profits from a small online business I'd started selling handmade jewelry and vintage items I'd refurbished, but I kept all of this private. Partly because I'd learned from Elena that talking about money often brought out the worst in people, and partly because I genuinely didn't care about impressing anyone with my financial success. I was happy with my simple lifestyle, proud of my meaningful work, and satisfied with the financial security I'd built for myself without anyone's help. Elena understood this about me in a way that Patricia never did. When I'd visit my grandmother at her modest house in East Sacramento, she'd ask thoughtful questions about my investments and nod approvingly when I told her about the latest addition to my portfolio. She never made me feel like I needed to justify my choices or prove my worth through material possessions. Money is a tool, mija, she'd tell me, using the Spanish term of endearment she'd called me since childhood. It should work for you, not the other way around. Too many people spend their lives working for money instead of making money work for them. Elena's house was a perfect reflection of her philosophy. From the outside, it looked like any other modest bungalow in the neighborhood. The furniture was comfortable but not expensive, the decorations were meaningful rather than flashy, and everything was well maintained but clearly had been purchased for function rather than status. You'd never guess that the woman living there was worth several $1,000,000. Patricia, meanwhile, seemed to believe that wealth should be displayed for everyone to see. She'd often make comments about how Elena was wasting her money by living so simply. She could afford a beautiful house in the hills, Patricia would complain to anyone who would listen. Instead, she chooses to live like she's still poor. It's such a shame. What Patricia didn't understand was that Elena's modest lifestyle was a choice, not a limitation. Elena had grown up truly poor, and she remembered what it felt like to worry about where her next meal would come from. She'd learned to find happiness in simple pleasures and meaningful relationships rather than material possessions, and no amount of wealth was going to change that fundamental part of who she was. I admired this about my grandmother tremendously. In a world where everyone seemed obsessed with showing off their success on social media and keeping up with their neighbors, Elena had found a way to be genuinely content with what she had while still building something substantial for her family's future. The irony was that I'd learned to live by the same principles, but Patricia interpreted my choices as evidence of financial struggle rather than financial wisdom. When I chose to walk or bike to work instead of driving, she saw it as proof that I couldn't afford gas. When I brought homemade food to family gatherings instead of expensive store-bought items, she assumed it was because I couldn't afford to buy anything nice. When I declined invitations to expensive restaurants or weekend trips to Napa Valley, she told other family members that I was too proud to admit I couldn't afford these luxuries. The truth was that I could afford these things, but I chose to spend my money differently. I preferred cooking at home because I enjoyed it and because it was healthier. I walked and biked because I cared about the environment and because I enjoyed the exercise. I declined expensive outings because I'd rather save that money for things that were more meaningful to me, like traveling to Costa Rica to volunteer with a reforestation project or taking a pottery class that I'd been wanting to try for months. But explaining these choices to Patricia felt impossible. She'd already decided what my life looked like, and she wasn't interested in hearing evidence that contradicted her assumptions. This became even more apparent as Elena got older and her health began to decline. Elena had been diagnosed with lung cancer the previous spring, and while she'd fought it with the same determination she'd brought to everything else in her life, it became clear by summer that she wasn't going to win this battle. Patricia immediately took charge of Elena's care, moving her from the modest house she loved into an expensive assisted living facility that Patricia thought was more appropriate for someone of Elena's means. Elena hated the new living situation, but she was too weak to fight Patricia's decision. When I'd visit her there, she'd complain about the fake flowers, the overpriced meals, and the staff members who treated residents like children. This place costs more in 1 month than I used to spend in 6 months at home, she'd tell me, shaking her head in frustration. Your mother thinks expensive means better, but sometimes expensive just means wasteful. During one of these visits, Elena had pulled me aside and spoken to me more seriously than she ever had before. Rebecca, I need you to know something, she'd said, her voice barely above a whisper. Your mother doesn't understand you, and she doesn't understand me either. She thinks money should be spent to impress other people, but you and I know that real wealth comes from security and freedom, not from showing off. She'd paused then, looking out the window of her sterile room at the manicured gardens of the facility. I've been watching you your whole life, Mija. I see how smart you are with money, how you've built something for yourself without anyone's help. Your mother sees your old car and your simple clothes and thinks you're struggling, but I see a young woman who understands what really matters. At the time, I'd thought she was just trying to make me feel better about the tension between Patricia and me. I had no idea that this conversation was Elena's way of preparing me for what was to come. Elena passed away on a quiet Thursday morning in September, surrounded by family members who had gathered to say their goodbyes. Patricia had orchestrated an elaborate funeral service that cost more than most people's annual salaries, complete with an ornate casket, hundreds of flowers, and a reception at one of Sacramento's most expensive hotels. During the reception, I overheard Patricia talking to my Aunt Dolores about Elena's will. I just hope she left enough to take care of Rebecca, Patricia was saying, her voice carrying that familiar tone of concern mixed with condescension. You know how she's been struggling lately. Elena always had a soft spot for her, so maybe she made sure Rebecca would be okay. I felt my face burn with embarrassment as other relatives nodded sympathetically, clearly having heard similar stories about my supposed financial difficulties. My cousin Miguel patted my shoulder and whispered, "Don't worry, prima. Abuela Elena was smart with money. I'm sure she made sure everyone in the family would be taken care of." The reading of the will was scheduled for the following Tuesday, giving everyone time to return to their normal routines and process their grief. Patricia spent the intervening days calling various family members to discuss what they thought Elena might have left behind and how it should be distributed. From the conversations I overheard, it was clear that everyone expected Elena's modest lifestyle meant that while she might have some savings, there wouldn't be anything truly substantial to inherit. Patricia had even made a point of telling me that whatever Elena had left me, I should be smart about it. "This might be your chance to get back on your feet financially," she'd said over coffee the morning before the reading. "Maybe you could use whatever grandma left you to go back to school or get some training for a better paying job. You're still young enough to turn your life around." A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. I'd simply nodded and thanked her for her concern, not bothering to correct her assumptions about my life or my finances. After years of trying to explain my choices to her, I'd learned that Patricia was more interested in maintaining her version of reality than in hearing the truth, which brings me back to that conference room at Henderson, Walsh and Associates, where attorney James Henderson was preparing to read Elena Rodriguez's last will and testament to a room full of family members who thought they knew exactly what to expect. The differences between my mother and grandmother became crystal clear to me when I was 16 and started working my first part-time job at a local bookstore called Chapter and Verse. While most teenagers would have immediately started spending their paychecks on clothes, makeup, and weekend entertainment, I found myself drawn to Elena's unconventional approach to money management. Every Sunday after family dinner, Elena would invite me to sit with her at her kitchen table while she reviewed her investment statements and business reports. Her dining room might have looked modest with its simple wooden furniture and hand-embroidered tablecloth, but those Sunday sessions were like attending a masterclass in financial strategy taught by someone who had built an empire from absolutely nothing. "Look at this, Rebecca," Elena would say, spreading out papers that detailed her various holdings. "This little grocery store I bought in Woodland 15 years ago? It was losing money when I purchased it, but I saw the potential. The previous owner didn't understand the community he was serving. He was trying to sell the same products you'd find in any suburban supermarket to a neighborhood full of Mexican immigrant families who wanted ingredients from home." She'd trace her finger along the profit margins, showing me how she'd gradually transformed the struggling store into a thriving business by listening to her customers and adapting to their needs. I started carrying masa harina, dried chiles, Mexican Coca-Cola in glass bottles, fresh tortillas made by local families. Simple changes, but they made all the difference. People started driving from 3 counties away to shop there. These lessons weren't just about business strategy. Elena was teaching me to see opportunities where others saw problems, to understand that real wealth came from providing value to people, and most importantly, to never underestimate the power of compound interest and patient investing. "Your mother," Elena would say with a gentle but knowing smile, "she thinks money is for spending. She sees $1 and immediately thinks about what she can buy with it. But you and I, Mija, we see $1 and think about what it could become, if we're smart about it." She wasn't wrong about Patricia's approach to money. My mother had grown up during Elena's most successful years, when the grocery store chain was expanding rapidly and the family had more money than they'd ever imagined possible. But instead of learning Elena's lessons about building wealth, Patricia had absorbed a different message entirely, that money was meant to be displayed, enjoyed, and used to elevate your social status. When Patricia married my father Richard in 1985, their combined incomes allowed them to live a lifestyle that most people could only dream of. Richard's real estate development company was thriving during the California building boom, and Patricia threw herself into the role of successful developer's wife with enthusiasm that bordered on obsession. I have vivid memories of Patricia spending entire weekends shopping for furniture that would make the right impression when they entertained clients. She'd drag me through showrooms in San Francisco, explaining why a $3,000 coffee table was somehow superior to a $300 one that looked almost identical to my untrained eye. "People notice quality, Rebecca," she'd lecture me as we examined yet another overpriced piece of furniture. "When your father's clients come to our house, they need to see that we're successful. It gives them confidence in his ability to handle their projects." Even as a child, this reasoning never quite made sense to me. It seemed like Patricia was more concerned with what other people thought about our family than with what actually made us happy or secure. The beautiful furniture was nice to look at, but it didn't seem to bring her any real joy. Instead, she was constantly worried about keeping it perfect, stressing over every water ring or scuff mark as if these minor imperfections somehow reflected poorly on her worth as a person. Elena, meanwhile, had furniture that was comfortable and functional, chosen because she liked it rather than because it impressed visitors. Her favorite chair was a worn leather recliner that had belonged to my grandfather, and she'd refused to replace it despite Patricia's frequent hints that it looked tired and outdated. Elena would just laugh and say that the chair had molded itself to her body over the years and that she'd rather be comfortable than impressive. This fundamental difference in values created a strange dynamic in our family. Patricia was constantly trying to elevate Elena's lifestyle, buying her expensive gifts that Elena would politely accept but rarely use. I remember one Christmas when Patricia gave Elena a designer handbag that cost more than a month's rent for most people. Elena thanked her graciously, but I noticed that she continued carrying the same practical black purse she'd used for years. "It's a beautiful bag," Elena told me later when Patricia was out of earshot, "but it's not me, you know? I need pockets. For my reading glasses and my grocery lists and my business cards. These fancy purses are like art pieces, nice to look at, but not very useful for actually living your life." As I got older, I began to understand that this wasn't just about handbags or furniture or cars. It was about two completely different philosophies of what made life meaningful. Patricia believed that external markers of success would bring happiness and respect, while Elena had learned that true security and contentment came from building something substantial that couldn't be taken away by economic downturns or changes in fashion. This became even clearer when I was 18 and preparing to choose a college major. Patricia had very strong opinions about what I should study, based entirely on earning potential and social prestige. She wanted me to major in business or pre-law, ideally at a prestigious private university that would position me to marry well and continue the family's upward social trajectory. "You're smart enough to be anything you want," she'd tell me, which sounded supportive until she'd add, "so why would you settle for something that doesn't pay well? You could be a lawyer or a doctor or run a major corporation. Don't waste your intelligence on some idealistic career that won't give you the life you deserve." Elena, however, had a completely different perspective when I confided in her about my interest in environmental science. Instead of focusing on salary potential or social status, she asked me thoughtful questions about what aspects of the field excited me most and how I envisioned using my degree to make a difference in the world. "Money follows passion, Mija," she told me during one of our Sunday kitchen table conversations. "When you love what you do and you're good at it, opportunities appear that you never could have planned for. But if you choose a career just because it pays well, you'll spend 40 years being miserable and probably won't even be very successful because your heart won't be in it." She shared stories about her own journey building the grocery store chain, how she'd started not because she thought it would make her wealthy, but because she saw families struggling to find familiar foods and wanted to help solve that problem. The financial success had come as a result of her genuine care for her customers and her willingness to work harder than anyone else in the industry. "Your mother thinks I was lucky," Elena continued, "but luck had nothing to do with it. I succeeded because I was solving a real problem for real people, and I was willing to learn and adapt when things didn't go according to plan. Money was never the goal, it was just the result of doing good work." This conversation gave me the confidence to pursue environmental science despite Patricia's disapproval. I enrolled at UC Davis, which had an excellent program but wasn't prestigious enough for Patricia's taste. She made her disappointment clear by constantly mentioning other family friends whose children were attending Stanford or Berkeley, always with a tone that suggested I was somehow settling for less than I could have achieved. During my college years, the contrast between Patricia's and Elena's approaches to money became even more pronounced. Patricia would send me generous monthly allowances and encourage me to enjoy college life by going out to expensive restaurants, taking spring break trips to resort destinations, and buying designer clothes that would help me network with the right kind of people. Elena, on the other hand, used my college years as an opportunity to teach me more sophisticated financial lessons. She helped me open my first investment account and walked me through the process of researching companies before buying their stock. She taught me about diversification, about the difference between growth and value investing, and about the importance of understanding a company's fundamentals before investing in it. "Most people your age think investing is like gambling," she explained as we reviewed my first portfolio together, "but it's actually the opposite. Gambling is hoping to get lucky with money you can't afford to lose. Investing is using money you don't need right now to buy pieces of companies that you believe will be more valuable in the future." She showed me how to read annual reports, how to understand basic financial statements, and how to think about risk and reward in a rational way. While my college friends were learning about these concepts in theoretical terms in their economics classes, I was getting hands-on experience with real money and real consequences. By my junior year, my small investment portfolio was generating enough income to cover most of my living expenses. I didn't need Patricia's monthly allowances anymore, but I continued accepting them and investing that money as well. Patricia interpreted my frugal lifestyle as evidence that the allowances weren't enough, and she'd often comment about how she worried I wasn't eating well or that I needed more money for textbooks and supplies. The reality was that I was eating very well. I'd learned to cook from Elena, who believed that preparing your own food was both economical and healthier than eating out constantly. I was also doing fine with textbooks because I discovered the used book market and had even started a small side business buying and reselling textbooks to other students, but Patricia saw my secondhand textbooks and home-cooked meals and concluded that I was struggling financially. She'd tell her friends about her poor college student daughter, who was working so hard to make ends meet, never realizing that I was actually building wealth faster than most people twice my age. Elena, however, understood exactly what I was doing. During my senior year, she pulled me aside after a family dinner where Patricia had once again made comments about how tough college life must be financially. "Your mother loves you," Elena said carefully, "but she doesn't understand that there's a difference between being poor and choosing to live below your means. She thinks anyone who doesn't spend all their money must not have enough money to spend. She's never learned that having money and showing money are two completely different things." Elena paused, looking thoughtful. "I've been poor, Mija. Really poor, where you don't know if you'll be able to pay rent or buy groceries. That's completely different from choosing to be careful with money so you can build something for the future. Your mother has never experienced real poverty, so she doesn't understand the security that comes from having options." This conversation helped me understand why Patricia seemed so concerned about my lifestyle choices. In her world, spending money was a sign of having money, and saving money was a sign of not having enough to spend. She genuinely believed that by living modestly, I was somehow suffering or limiting myself. Elena's perspective was exactly the opposite. She saw my modest lifestyle as evidence of wisdom and self-discipline, qualities that would serve me well throughout my life. She understood that I was choosing to live simply not because I had to, but because I wanted to build something substantial for my future. As graduation approached, these different philosophies about money and success would set the stage for the years of misunderstanding that would follow, ultimately leading to that moment in the lawyer's office when everyone's assumptions about my life would be turned completely upside down. After graduating from UC Davis, I landed a position with Green Valley Conservation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to promoting sustainable farming practices throughout California's Central Valley. The work was exactly what I'd dreamed of during my college years, conducting soil analysis for organic farmers, developing water conservation strategies, and helping small agricultural operations transition to environmentally responsible growing methods. My starting salary was $38,000 annually, which Patricia immediately seized upon as confirmation of her worst fears about my career choice. The day I told her about the job offer, she actually winced as if I'd announced I was volunteering to work for free. "$38,000, she repeated, her voice rising in disbelief. "Rebecca, that's barely above minimum wage when you calculate it hourly. Your cousin David makes that much in 6 weeks working at his father's dealership, and he didn't even finish college." What Patricia didn't know was that I'd negotiated several additional benefits that significantly improved my compensation package. Green Valley Conservation allowed me to work from home 2 days per week, which eliminated commuting costs and gave me flexibility to pursue other income streams. They also provided excellent health insurance, contributed generously to a retirement account, and offered professional development opportunities that would enhance my expertise in emerging environmental technologies. More importantly, the modest salary was just one component of my overall financial strategy. During my final semester at UC Davis, my investment portfolio had grown to nearly $45,000. I'd also purchased a small duplex near the university using a combination of my savings and a first-time buyer's program, renting out both units to graduate students while I lived with Elena during my job search. The rental income from the duplex alone generated $800 monthly after expenses, effectively increasing my nonprofit salary by almost $10,000 per year. Combined with dividends from my stock holdings and profits from my expanded textbook reselling business, my actual annual income was closer to $60,000, not spectacular by Patricia's standards, but quite respectable for someone just starting their career. Yet because Patricia only saw the nonprofit salary figure, she became convinced that I was heading toward financial disaster. She began what she called helping me plan for my future, which mostly involved criticizing my choices and suggesting alternatives that aligned more closely with her vision of success. "You could still apply to law school," she'd mentioned during family dinners. "Your LSAT scores were excellent, and I know several attorneys who started later in life. Environmental law is actually quite lucrative if you work for the right firms. When I'd politely decline these suggestions, Patricia would shake her head sadly and make comments about how I was wasting my potential or settling for less than I deserved. She seemed genuinely convinced that I was making these choices out of some misguided idealism that would eventually lead to poverty and regret. Elena, meanwhile, was fascinated by the details of my work and impressed by how I'd structured my finances to support a career I was passionate about. During our continued Sunday conversations, she'd ask thoughtful questions about the environmental challenges I was helping farmers address and nod approvingly when I described the innovative solutions we were implementing. "You're doing exactly what I did when I started my business," she told me one afternoon as we reviewed my latest investment statements. "You're solving real problems for people who need help, you're learning valuable skills that will make you more effective over time, and you're building multiple income streams instead of depending on just one source. This is how wealth is really created, Mija." Elena also understood something that Patricia missed entirely. I was accumulating assets and expertise that would pay dividends for decades to come. The duplex was already appreciating in value, my investment portfolio was growing through both contributions and market gains, and my specialized knowledge in sustainable agriculture was becoming increasingly valuable as environmental concerns moved into the mainstream. But Patricia's concern about my financial situation began extending beyond private family conversations. I started noticing that she'd bring up my struggles in front of relatives, friends, and even casual acquaintances, often in ways that were supposedly supportive but actually quite embarrassing. At my cousin Maria's wedding reception, I overheard Patricia telling a table full of distant relatives about how worried she was about my career prospects. "Rebecca is such a bright girl," she was saying, "but she's chosen this idealistic path that doesn't pay very well. I keep hoping she'll realize that she needs to be more practical about her future." When I joined the conversation, Patricia immediately shifted into what I'd come to recognize as her concerned mother mode. "We were just talking about your work, honey. I was explaining how dedicated you are to helping the environment, even though it means making financial sacrifices." The assumption behind her words, that I was making sacrifices rather than smart choices, was both frustrating and revealing. Patricia simply couldn't conceive of a scenario where someone might choose meaningful work over maximum salary and still achieve financial security. In her worldview, you either pursued money or you pursued purpose, but never both simultaneously. This became even more apparent when I decided to purchase a larger property in Midtown Sacramento. I'd found a historic house that had been converted into 4 apartments, with the owner motivated to sell quickly due to health issues. The building needed some cosmetic improvements but was structurally sound and located in a neighborhood that was clearly gentrifying. Using the equity I'd built in the duplex, profits from my various side businesses, and a significant portion of my investment portfolio, I was able to make a cash offer that the seller accepted immediately. The 4 apartments would generate enough rental income to cover the mortgage on my previous property while providing additional monthly cash flow, effectively allowing me to own both buildings without any out-of-pocket housing costs. It was exactly the kind of strategic move that Elena had been teaching me about for years, using leverage and cash flow to build wealth systematically while minimizing personal expenses. Elena was thrilled when I explained the details of the transaction, calling it brilliant and praising my ability to see opportunities that others missed. Patricia, however, had a completely different reaction when I mentioned my new living situation. I'd simply told her that I'd moved to a different neighborhood, not realizing that she'd drive by to see the property and draw her own conclusions about what my life looked like. The historic building, while structurally sound and financially profitable, was not particularly impressive from the outside. The previous owner had deferred maintenance on the exterior, and the neighborhood, though improving, still had some rough edges. When Patricia saw where I was living, she became convinced that my financial situation had deteriorated even further. "Rebecca, honey," she said when she called me that evening, her voice heavy with concern, "I drove by your new place today, and I'm really worried about you. That neighborhood doesn't look safe, and the building looks like it needs a lot of work. Are you sure you can afford to live somewhere better?" I tried to explain that appearances could be deceiving and that I'd actually made a smart investment, but Patricia wasn't interested in hearing about cash flow or property values. She'd already decided that I was living in a rundown building in a questionable neighborhood because I couldn't afford anything better. This misunderstanding marked the beginning of a more intense period of Patricia's interventions in my life. She started making unexpected visits, always armed with groceries or household items that she was convinced I needed but couldn't afford to buy for myself. She'd arrive with bags full of expensive organic food, explaining that she happened to be at Whole Foods and thought I might enjoy some good quality groceries. These visits were particularly awkward because my apartment was actually quite nice. I'd renovated the unit I lived in using my construction connections from watching my father's business, installing hardwood floors, updating the kitchen with stainless steel appliances, and creating a comfortable space that reflected my personal style rather than my mother's taste for expensive brand names. But Patricia would walk through my apartment and see only what confirmed her existing assumptions. She'd noticed that my furniture was mostly vintage pieces I'd restored myself rather than expensive new items, that my clothes came from thrift stores rather than department stores, and that I didn't have the latest electronics or gadgets that she considered essential for modern living. You know, she'd say while examining my refurbished dining room table, I have some extra furniture in storage that might work better in here. This table is charming, but it's not very practical for entertaining. What she didn't understand was that I loved my carefully curated space precisely because everything in it had a story and served a purpose. The dining room table had been rescued from an estate sale and restored using techniques I'd learned from YouTube videos and library books. The vintage Persian rug had been a find at a warehouse clearance, authentic and beautiful despite costing a fraction of what similar pieces sold for in retail stores. Elena, during one of her visits to my apartment, had immediately grasped what I was trying to create. "This feels like a real home," she'd said, running her hand along the smooth surface of my refinished table. "Everything here was chosen because you love it, not because someone told you it was impressive. That's how you build a life that makes you happy instead of a life that makes other people envious." But Patricia's visits became increasingly frequent and increasingly loaded with suggestions about how I could improve my situation. She'd bring newspaper clippings about job openings at corporations, brochures for graduate school programs that might lead to higher-paying careers, and even business cards for financial advisors who could help me get back on track. The most frustrating part was that Patricia's concern was genuine. She truly believed that I was struggling and that her interventions were necessary to prevent me from falling into serious financial trouble. She'd tell other family members about how she was keeping an eye on Rebecca, and how worried she was about my ability to support myself long-term. This narrative began taking on a life of its own within our extended family. Relatives who barely knew me started treating me with the kind of gentle sympathy usually reserved for people recovering from serious illness or major life disasters. At family gatherings, aunts and uncles would ask careful questions about how I was managing and offer encouragement about how things would get better eventually. My cousin Sandra, who worked as a bank manager, even pulled me aside at a family barbecue to offer advice about budgeting and debt management. "I know things are tight right now," she said with genuine kindness, "but there are resources available to help people in your situation. I could connect you with some financial counselors who work with people who are having trouble making ends meet." I was so stunned by the conversation that I didn't even know how to respond. The idea that my family thought I needed financial counseling was both hilarious and heartbreaking. I was actually in the best financial position of anyone in my generation of the family, but because I didn't display my wealth in ways they recognized, they'd concluded that I was barely surviving. Elena noticed what was happening and tried to subtly defend my choices when opportunities arose, but she was also careful not to reveal details about my actual financial situation. "Rebecca is very smart with money," she'd tell relatives who expressed concern. "She's building something substantial for her future, even if it doesn't look like what you might expect." But these gentle corrections couldn't compete with Patricia's more dramatic narrative about my supposed struggles. Patricia's version of my life was more compelling because it fit familiar patterns, the idealistic young person who chose passion over practicality and was now paying the price for that decision. As Elena's health began declining and family attention turned toward caring for her, the misconceptions about my financial situation became even more entrenched, setting the stage for the dramatic revelation that would eventually unfold in that lawyer's office. 3 years into my career at Green Valley Conservation, my financial portfolio had grown substantially beyond what anyone in my family could have imagined. My real estate holdings now included 4 properties generating over $3,000 in monthly rental income, my investment accounts had surpassed $200,000, and I'd launched a consulting business helping organic farms implement sustainable water management systems. The consulting work had started organically when farmers I'd worked with through the nonprofit began recommending my services to their neighbors. What began as weekend side projects had evolved into a legitimate business that charged premium rates for specialized expertise. Agricultural operations throughout Northern California were willing to pay substantial fees for someone who could help them reduce water usage while maintaining crop yields, especially as drought conditions made water conservation increasingly critical. By this point, my combined annual income from all sources exceeded $120,000. putting me comfortably in the upper middle class bracket. I was contributing maximum amounts to retirement accounts, building an emergency fund that could cover 2 years of expenses, and still had enough discretionary income to travel, pursue hobbies, and make additional investments. Yet Patricia's perception of my financial situation had somehow grown even more dire during this same period. The better I actually did financially, the more convinced she became that I was heading toward disaster. This paradox reached its peak when I decided to expand my consulting business by purchasing specialized equipment for soil analysis and water quality testing. The equipment cost $45,000, but it would allow me to offer more comprehensive services and charge significantly higher rates. It was exactly the kind of business investment that Elena had taught me to recognize, spending money to make money, rather than spending money to impress people. I arranged the purchase through my business account and had the equipment delivered to a small warehouse space I'd rented to serve as my consulting headquarters. The warehouse was in an industrial area of Sacramento, chosen for its affordability and convenient access to highway routes that connected me to farm clients throughout the region. Patricia happened to drive by the warehouse one afternoon when I was loading equipment into my truck for a client visit. What she saw was her daughter working alone in what appeared to be a rundown building in an industrial area, handling what looked like heavy machinery and loading boxes into an old pickup truck I'd purchased specifically for farm visits. That evening, Patricia called me in tears. "Rebecca, I can't stand watching you struggle like this anymore," she began, her voice shaking with emotion. "I saw you today at that warehouse, doing manual labor like some kind of, I don't even know what. This has gone too far. You need help, and I'm going to make sure you get it." I tried to explain that the warehouse was my business headquarters and that the manual labor she'd witnessed was me loading expensive scientific equipment for a lucrative consulting project, but Patricia wasn't interested in hearing explanations. That contradicted her narrative. "Honey, I know you're trying to put a positive spin on this, but I have eyes," she said. "You're working multiple jobs just to make ends meet, living in that rundown building, driving that old truck. This isn't sustainable. You're going to burn yourself out, and then what? You'll have no savings, no retirement, no security." The irony was almost unbearable. Patricia was describing someone with no savings while talking to someone who had accumulated more wealth in 5 years than most people managed in decades. She was worried about my retirement while I was already maxing out multiple retirement accounts and had built an investment portfolio that could theoretically support me indefinitely. But Patricia's concern had evolved beyond private worry into active intervention. She began researching job opportunities that she thought would be more suitable for someone with my education and intelligence. She'd email me listings for corporate positions with Fortune 500 companies, government jobs with comprehensive benefits packages, and even entry-level positions at law firms that might lead to better opportunities. "I found the perfect position for you," she announced during a family dinner, producing a printed job description with obvious pride. "It's an environmental compliance specialist position with PG&E. The starting salary is $75,000, plus excellent benefits, and there's real potential for advancement. I already called the hiring manager and mentioned that my daughter might be interested." The position she'd found was indeed well-paying and stable, but it would have meant giving up everything I'd built, my consulting business, my flexible schedule, my direct impact on sustainable farming practices, and my rapidly growing income. It would have been like trading a thriving entrepreneurial venture for the security of a corporate cubicle. When I politely declined to apply, Patricia's frustration boiled over. "I don't understand you anymore, Rebecca," she said, her voice rising in exasperation. "You're living like a pauper when you could have a real career with real security. Do you enjoy struggling? Is this some kind of martyrdom complex?" The conversation attracted the attention of other family members, who began weighing in with their own opinions about my career choices. My uncle Robert, who worked in insurance sales, suggested that I was being unrealistic about my prospects in the environmental field. My Aunt Carmen wondered aloud whether I might be suffering from depression or some other condition that was affecting my judgment. "Sometimes people self-sabotage when they're afraid of success," Carmen said with the authority of someone who'd taken a few psychology classes in college. "Maybe Rebecca is scared of the responsibility that comes with a high-paying job, so she's keeping herself in situations where she doesn't have to worry about meeting expectations." These conversations were particularly difficult because they took place in front of Elena, whose health was visibly declining but whose mind remained sharp. I could see the frustration in her eyes as family members discussed my life as if I were a troubled teenager rather than a successful adult who'd built a thriving business. During one especially painful family gathering, Patricia actually broke down crying while describing her fears about my future. "I lie awake at night worrying about what's going to happen to her," she told the assembled relatives. She's so smart and talented, but she's throwing her life away on these idealistic projects that don't pay anything. What happens when she's 50 and realizes she has no savings, no career prospects, no security? Elena caught my eye from across the room and gave me a barely perceptible nod, as if to say that she understood what I was going through and that I should stay strong. But even Elena's support couldn't completely offset the emotional toll of having my entire family convinced that I was failing at life. The situation became even more complicated when Patricia decided to take direct action to help me improve my financial situation. She began making substantial deposits into a bank account she'd opened in my name, explaining that she wanted to make sure I had something to fall back on in case my various projects didn't work out. "I know you're too proud to ask for help," she said when she handed me the account information, "but I can't stand the thought of you struggling when I have the means to make things easier. This isn't charity, think of it as an investment in your future." The deposits were significant. Several $1,000s every few months, and Patricia clearly expected me to use the money for basic living expenses. She'd make comments about how I could finally afford to shop at better grocery stores or move to a nicer apartment, never realizing that I was already living exactly how I chose to live. I found myself in an impossible position. If I didn't use the money, Patricia would see it as evidence that I was too proud to accept help, which would only increase her worry about my financial situation. If I did use the money, it would reinforce her belief that I needed her assistance to survive, which would encourage more interventions in the future. I compromised by using Patricia's deposits to fund additional investments, effectively turning her concerned gifts into fuel for my growing wealth. But this solution created its own problems when Patricia would ask about how I'd spent the money and I'd have to give vague answers about covering expenses and getting caught up on bills. These conversations made me feel like I was living a double life. During the day, I'd meet with prosperous farmers who paid premium rates for my consulting services, review investment portfolios that grew larger every month, and make strategic decisions about expanding my business operations. But during family gatherings, I'd sit quietly while relatives discussed my supposed financial struggles and made well-meaning suggestions about how I could improve my situation. The stress of maintaining this facade was beginning to affect my relationship with Elena, who was clearly frustrated by the family's misunderstanding of my circumstances but was also reluctant to violate my privacy by correcting their assumptions. During one of our last private conversations before her health declined significantly, she addressed the situation directly. "I know this is difficult for you, Mija," she said, reaching across her kitchen table to squeeze my hand. "Your mother loves you, but she's never learned to see past appearances to understand what's really happening. She looks at your life and sees what she expects to see, not what's actually there." Elena paused, her breathing labored from the cancer that was slowly taking her strength. "I've been thinking about how to handle this situation, and I believe there will come a time when the truth needs to be revealed. Not for your mother's sake, but for yours. You shouldn't have to live your life apologizing for choices that are actually quite brilliant." At the time, I thought she was simply encouraging me to be more assertive about defending my lifestyle choices. I had no idea that Elena was already planning something that would ultimately expose the truth about my financial situation in the most dramatic way possible. As Elena's condition worsened and preparations began for what everyone knew would be her final months, the family's concern about my supposed financial struggles intensified. Relatives began making comments about how Elena's passing would affect me more than others because I didn't have the same resources to fall back on that other family members enjoyed. These conversations planted the seeds for the assumptions that would ultimately be shattered when Elena's will was read, revealing not only the true extent of her wealth but also the shocking truth about mine. Elena's cancer progressed rapidly during the summer months, and by August, it became clear that she had weeks rather than months remaining. Patricia immediately took charge of the situation with her characteristic determination to control every detail, making decisions about Elena's care that prioritized expensive medical treatments and luxury accommodations over Elena's clearly expressed wishes for comfort and dignity. The assisted living facility Patricia chose cost $12,000 monthly and specialized in what their brochures called executive end-of-life care. The rooms were elegantly appointed with mahogany furniture and crystal chandeliers, the staff wore crisp uniforms and spoke in hushed, reverent tones, and every service from meal preparation to medical monitoring carried premium price tags that Patricia seemed to view as evidence of superior quality. Elena hated everything about the place. During my visits, she'd complain about the artificial flowers that were replaced weekly whether they needed it or not, the gourmet meals that were beautifully presented but lacked the simple flavors she craved, and the staff members who treated her like a fragile antique rather than a person with opinions and preferences. "They're charging your mother a fortune for things I never asked for," Elena confided during one of our last coherent conversations. I wanted to spend my final weeks at home, maybe with a hospice nurse to help with pain management. Instead, I'm in this expensive hotel where strangers make every decision about my daily life. But when I suggested to Patricia that we might honor Elena's wishes by exploring in-home care options, she became visibly upset. "Rebecca, this is not the time to be penny pinching," she said sharply. "Mother deserves the absolute best care available, regardless of cost. I know money is tight for you, but this is about doing what's right for the family." The irony was profound. Patricia was spending Elena's money on expensive care that Elena didn't want, while assuming that I was too financially strapped to contribute to alternatives that would have been both less expensive and more aligned with Elena's actual preferences. Patricia's equation of expensive with appropriate was causing exactly the kind of wasteful spending that Elena had spent decades teaching me to avoid. During Elena's final weeks, Patricia's anxiety about my financial future reached crisis levels. She seemed convinced that Elena's death would somehow leave me completely adrift, unable to afford basic necessities without family support. She began making increasingly dramatic gestures designed to secure my financial stability. The most shocking of these interventions came on a Tuesday evening in early September. I was at the assisted living facility visiting Elena when Patricia arrived carrying a manila folder thick with documents. She asked Elena's nurse to give us privacy, then sat down at the small table in Elena's room with an expression of grim determination. "I've been thinking about your situation, Rebecca," Patricia began, opening the folder to reveal what appeared to be official paperwork. "After Mother passes, you're going to need real financial security, not just the hand-to-mouth existence you've been managing. I've made some arrangements." The documents turned out to be paperwork for a trust fund that Patricia had established using money from her and my father's savings. The trust contained $200,000 and was structured to provide me with monthly payments designed to supplement what Patricia assumed was my inadequate income from the nonprofit job. "This isn't charity," Patricia explained, her voice emotional. "This is family taking care of family. Your father and I have more than enough for our retirement, and we can't stand the thought of you struggling when we have the means to help." I was speechless. Patricia had essentially given me a substantial inheritance while she was still alive, based entirely on her misconceptions about my financial situation. The monthly payments from the trust would provide more money than I actually spent on living expenses, since my real estate investments already covered my housing costs and my consulting business generated far more income than my official nonprofit salary. Elena, despite her weakened condition, was alert enough to understand what was happening. She caught my eye and gave me a look that was equal parts sympathy and frustration. Here was Patricia, demonstrating her love through a generous gesture that was completely unnecessary and based on entirely false assumptions about my life. "Mom, this is incredibly generous, but I don't think," I began, but Patricia cut me off. "No arguments, Rebecca. The paperwork is already filed, and the trust is irrevocable. You'll start receiving payments next month, and they'll continue for the next 20 years. This will give you the security to maybe take some risks with your career, perhaps go back to school or transition into something more lucrative." The conversation took place in front of Elena, who was clearly struggling with whether to reveal the truth about my actual financial situation. I could see the internal conflict playing out on her face as she listened to Patricia describe her fears about my future and her relief at having found a solution. After Patricia left that evening, Elena and I sat in silence for several minutes before she finally spoke. "Your mother just gave you $200,000 because she thinks you're poor," she said, shaking her head with a mixture of amazement and frustration. "Meanwhile, you probably have more liquid assets than she does." Elena's observation was accurate. Between my investment accounts, business savings, and real estate equity, my net worth had surpassed $400,000. Patricia's trust fund, while enormously generous, was essentially doubling money I didn't need with funds that she and my father might actually need for their own future care. "What should I do?" I asked Elena. "If I tell her the truth now, she'll be humiliated that she made such wrong assumptions. But if I accept the money, I'm basically stealing from her based on lies." Elena was quiet for a long time, her breathing labored but her mind clearly working through the complexities of the situation. "Your mother has never learned to separate love from money," she finally said. "She shows love by spending money, and she assumes that needing money means someone isn't loved enough. Breaking that pattern will require more than just revealing your bank statements." Elena paused, seeming to gather strength for what she wanted to say next. "I've been thinking about this problem for years, watching how your mother misunderstands both of us. I think there comes a time when the truth needs to be revealed in a way that can't be ignored or explained away. Not to hurt anyone, but to help everyone understand what's real and what's assumption." At the time, I thought Elena was simply encouraging me to be more honest about my financial success. I had no idea that she was already planning a revelation. That would expose not only my true situation but also the extent of her own carefully hidden wealth. The trust fund situation created an immediate crisis for me. Patricia began calling regularly to check on how I was adjusting to having more financial security, making comments about how relieved she was that I could finally relax a little about money. She'd suggest that I could now afford to move to a better apartment, shop at nicer stores, or take a vacation without worrying about the cost. These conversations were torture because they required me to either lie outright or remain vague about how I was using the money. In reality, I was investing Patricia's monthly payments just like I'd invested all her previous gifts, effectively using her generosity to build wealth that she didn't know I already possessed. The situation became even more complicated when other family members learned about the trust fund. Patricia, proud of her solution to my supposed financial problems, had shared details of her generous gesture with relatives who were already concerned about my welfare. The family's response was overwhelmingly positive, with everyone praising Patricia for her foresight and expressing relief that I would finally have some financial stability. My cousin Sandra actually called to congratulate me on having such a caring mother. "I think it's wonderful that Aunt Patricia recognized how much you've been struggling and found a way to help without making you feel like a charity case," she said. "Now you can focus on your environmental work without worrying about making ends meet." These conversations reinforced how deeply entrenched the family's misconceptions had become. The trust fund wasn't seen as Patricia's generous but unnecessary gift to a successful daughter. It was viewed as a necessary rescue of a struggling family member who'd been too proud to ask for help. Elena's condition deteriorated rapidly during the second week of September. She slipped into unconsciousness on a Wednesday afternoon and passed away peacefully on Friday morning, surrounded by family members who had gathered to say their final goodbyes. The funeral arrangements that Patricia orchestrated were as elaborate and expensive as everything else she'd managed during Elena's final months. The service was held at Sacramento's most prestigious funeral home, with hundreds of flowers, a catered reception for over 200 guests, and a mahogany casket that cost more than many people's annual salaries. During the reception, I overheard conversations that revealed how the family's narrative about my financial situation had evolved during Elena's final weeks. Relatives were discussing how Elena's death would affect me differently than others because of my limited resources, expressing gratitude that Patricia had established the trust fund to provide me with some security during my grief. "It's so sad that Rebecca has to worry about money on top of losing her grandmother," I heard my Aunt Dolores saying to a family friend. "At least Patricia had the foresight to set up that trust fund. Elena would have been so worried about leaving Rebecca without any support." The irony was overwhelming. Elena had actually been deeply concerned about the family's misunderstanding of my situation, not about my need for financial support. Her worry had been about the growing deception and the unsustainable position it had created for everyone involved. During the reception, Patricia pulled me aside to discuss practical matters related to Elena's estate. "The lawyer wants to meet with everyone next Tuesday to read the will," she said. "I don't expect there will be any surprises. Mother lived very modestly, so there probably isn't much to distribute. But she was always careful with money, so I'm sure she left something for each of the grandchildren." Patricia's assumption that Elena's modest lifestyle indicated modest wealth was exactly the kind of thinking that had led to all the misunderstandings about my own situation. She'd never grasped Elena's philosophy that true wealth often looked quite different from what people expected. "The important thing," Patricia continued, "is that you don't need to worry about money anymore. Between the trust fund and whatever small inheritance Grandma might have left, you'll have enough security to really focus on finding a more stable career path." As I listened to Patricia plan my post-inheritance future based on assumptions that were completely wrong, I realized that the will reading was going to be far more dramatic than anyone expected. Elena had spent years watching our family operate under false assumptions about both her wealth and mine, and I had a growing suspicion that she'd planned something that would finally force everyone to confront the truth. The stage was set for revelations that would shatter every assumption the family had made about money, success, and who was really taking care of whom. The conference room at Henderson, Walsh and Associates felt unnaturally formal for what everyone expected to be a straightforward reading of a modest will. Mahogany panels lined the walls, and oil paintings of distinguished-looking judges gazed down at the gathering of 23 family members who had assembled on that Tuesday afternoon in October. Attorney James Henderson, a distinguished man in his 70s who had handled Elena's legal affairs for over 30 years, entered carrying a thick leather portfolio that seemed surprisingly substantial for someone who had supposedly lived such a simple life. Patricia, seated directly across from me at the polished conference table, caught my eye and gave me an encouraging smile, clearly believing this process would quickly confirm her assumptions about Elena's modest estate. Before we begin, Henderson announced, adjusting his reading glasses, I want to acknowledge that Mrs. Rodriguez was very specific about how she wanted this information presented. She spent considerable time ensuring that her wishes would be communicated clearly and that everyone present would understand her reasoning. Henderson opened the portfolio and withdrew several documents, including what appeared to be a lengthy letter in Elena's careful handwriting. Elena Rodriguez requested that I begin not with the traditional reading of bequests, but with a statement she prepared explaining her decisions and her observations about family dynamics. Patricia shifted uncomfortably in her chair, clearly not expecting personal commentary as part of the proceedings. Other family members exchanged glances, unsure what Elena might have wanted to communicate beyond the standard distribution of her modest possessions. Henderson cleared his throat and began reading Elena's words, "To my beloved family gathered. In this room, I want you to understand that everything I am about to reveal has been carefully planned to address misunderstandings that have persisted for far too long." The lawyer paused, looking around the room to ensure everyone was paying attention. I have spent the last several years watching my family operate under assumptions that are not only incorrect but harmful to the people I love most. Today, these assumptions will be corrected, not to embarrass anyone, but to free everyone from the burden of living with false beliefs. My heart began racing as I realized Elena had indeed planned something dramatic. Patricia leaned forward, her brow furrowed with confusion about what assumptions Elena could possibly be referring to. Henderson continued, "First, I need to address the persistent belief that my granddaughter Rebecca has been struggling financially. This belief, held most strongly by my daughter Patricia, has led to years of unnecessary worry and inappropriate interventions based on completely false premises." The silence in the room became absolute. Patricia's face had gone pale, and I could see other family members trying to process what they were hearing. "Rebecca," Henderson read, "has built substantial wealth through intelligent investing, strategic real estate acquisitions, and a thriving consulting business that generates far more income than her nonprofit salary suggests. As of my last conversation with her, her net worth exceeded $400,000, making her one of the most financially successful people in this room." Gasps echoed throughout the conference room. Patricia's mouth had fallen open, and she was staring at me as if seeing a stranger. My cousin Sandra actually laughed out loud, apparently thinking this was some kind of joke, until she saw the serious expressions on everyone else's faces. "The money Patricia has given Rebecca through various rescue attempts has been unnecessary and, frankly, taken from her own retirement savings that she may actually need in the future," Elena's letter continued. "Rebecca accepted these gifts graciously to avoid hurting Patricia's feelings, but they have been invested rather than spent, as Rebecca has never needed financial assistance." Henderson paused to let this information sink in before continuing. "I am revealing this information not to embarrass Patricia, whose love and concern for her daughter are genuine, but to illustrate how assumptions can blind us to reality." Patricia looked at Rebecca's simple lifestyle and assumed poverty, when she should have recognized the intelligence and discipline that Elena Rodriguez herself employed to build wealth. Patricia was now staring directly at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of shock, confusion, and something that might have been anger. "Is this true?" she whispered, her voice barely audible in the large room. Before I could respond, Henderson continued reading, "This brings me to the second major revelation of today's proceedings. My own estate, which Patricia and others have assumed to be modest based on my simple lifestyle, is substantially larger than anyone in this room has imagined." Henderson withdrew a financial statement from the portfolio, the numbers clearly visible even from across the table. Elena Rodriguez's total estate is valued at $12.7 million. The silence that followed was deafening. Someone dropped their pen, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the stunned room. Patricia's face had gone from pale to ashen, and she appeared to be having trouble breathing. "This wealth," Henderson read, "was accumulated through the systematic expansion of my grocery store business, prudent real estate investments throughout Northern California, and careful stock market investments spanning 4 decades. I chose to live modestly not because I lacked resources, but because I preferred simplicity and because I wanted to observe how my family would treat money and each other when they believed resources were limited." Henderson looked up from the document to address the room directly. Mrs. Rodriguez was very clear that she wanted everyone to understand her philosophy before we discussed the distribution of her assets. She believed that how people handle money reveals their true character, and she wanted to make her bequests based on demonstrated wisdom rather than assumed need. Patricia finally found her voice. $12 million, she repeated, the number seeming impossible to her. "But she lived in that little house, drove that old car, never spent money on anything expensive because," Henderson replied, Returning to Elena's letter, I learned early in life that happiness comes from security and purpose, not from displaying wealth to impress others. Every dollar I didn't spend on luxury items was a dollar that could work for my family's future. My granddaughter Rebecca understood this principle intuitively, which is why she has achieved financial success at such a young age. The lawyer withdrew several more documents from his portfolio. Now, regarding the distribution of Mrs. Rodriguez's estate. She has made her decisions based on demonstrated financial wisdom and character, rather than on assumptions about who needs help. Henderson began reading the specific bequests. To my daughter Patricia Martinez, who has always been generous with her own resources and has shown tremendous love for her family, I leave $500,000, along with my hope that she will learn to see past appearances to understand what is real. Patricia's breathing had become shallow, and she was gripping the edge of the table. $500,000 was far more than she had ever imagined possible, but it was clearly not the largest bequest being distributed. To my other children and their families, Henderson continued, I leave various amounts ranging from $50,000 to $200,000, distributed according to their demonstrated responsibility with money and their understanding of the difference between wealth and materialism. He paused, looking directly at me. To my granddaughter Rebecca Martinez, who has proven herself to be the true inheritor of my financial philosophy and business acumen, I leave the remainder of my estate, including all business holdings, real estate investments, and liquid assets, totaling approximately $8.2 million. The number hung in the air like a physical presence. I felt dizzy, unable to fully process what I had just heard. $8 million. Combined with my existing assets, I was suddenly worth nearly $9 million, making me one of the wealthiest people in Sacramento County, but the financial impact was secondary to the emotional tsunami that was sweeping through the room. Patricia was staring at me with an expression I had never seen before, a mixture of shock, embarrassment, and what appeared to be genuine bewilderment about how she could have been so wrong about something so fundamental. Henderson wasn't finished. Mrs. Rodriguez has included specific instructions regarding her business holdings. The grocery store chain, currently valued at approximately $3.5 million, is to be managed by Rebecca with complete autonomy. However, Mrs. Rodriguez has expressed her hope that Rebecca will consider involving other family members in the business operations, provided they demonstrate genuine understanding of her principles. Elena's letter concluded with personal messages. To Patricia, I hope you will forgive me for allowing this misunderstanding to persist for so long. I wanted you to see for yourself that your assumptions about Rebecca were wrong, and that love should not be confused with financial rescue. Your daughter is brilliant and successful, and she deserves your respect and admiration, not your pity. To Rebecca, you have proven yourself worthy of this inheritance not just through your financial success, but through your grace in handling your mother's misguided attempts to help. Use this wealth wisely, as I know you will, and remember that money is always a tool, never a destination. Henderson folded the letter and looked around the room. This concludes the reading of Elena Rodriguez's will. I'm available to answer questions about the practical aspects of estate administration, but I believe Mrs. Rodriguez has made her intentions quite clear. The silence that followed lasted nearly 2 full minutes. Finally, Patricia spoke, her voice cracked and uncertain. Rebecca, I don't understand. Why didn't you tell me? All this time, I thought. I was so worried about you. The conversation that followed was unlike any we had ever had. For the first time in my adult life, Patricia was looking at me not as someone who needed her help, but as someone she didn't know at all. The revelation had shattered not just her assumptions about my finances, but her entire understanding of who I was as a person. I tried to tell you, I said gently, but you had already decided what my life looked like. Every time I mentioned an investment or a business success, you assumed I was putting a positive spin on failure. It became easier to just let you believe what you wanted to believe. Other family members began voicing their own shock and confusion. The narrative they had all accepted, that I was the struggling idealist who needed family support, had been completely demolished. They were now looking at someone who had been secretly more successful than any of them, while accepting their sympathy and financial help with grace. Patricia was crying now, not from sadness but from a complex mixture of emotions that included embarrassment, relief, and genuine confusion about how she had misread the situation so completely. I gave you that trust fund, she said, laughing through her tears. I was trying to rescue someone who was already wealthy. And I invested every penny of it, I admitted, because I didn't need it for living expenses. Your generosity has actually made me even wealthier, though that was never your intention. The transformation in the room was remarkable. Family members who had spent years treating me with gentle sympathy were now looking at me with something approaching awe. The dynamics had shifted so completely that several relatives were now asking me for financial advice, apparently assuming that my success qualified me to solve their own money problems, but the most profound change was in Patricia herself. The revelation had forced her to confront not just her assumptions about me, but her entire approach to understanding other people's lives. She was learning, perhaps for the first time, that appearances could be not just deceiving but completely opposite to reality. The months following Elena's will reading brought changes to our family that went far deeper than the redistribution of wealth. The revelation had shattered assumptions that had shaped family dynamics for years, forcing everyone to reconsider not just what they thought they knew about me, but how they understood success, love, and the complex relationship between money and family. Patricia's transformation was perhaps the most dramatic. In the weeks immediately after the will reading, she went through what could only be described as a complete reevaluation of her worldview. The woman who had spent years worrying about my financial stability was now grappling with the reality that her struggling daughter was worth nearly $9 million, while her own assumptions about success and security had been revealed as fundamentally flawed. "I keep thinking about all those conversations," Patricia told me during one of our first honest talks after the revelation, where I was giving you advice about money management and career choices. "I must have sounded ridiculous to you, lecturing someone who was already more financially successful than your father and I have ever been." The embarrassment was painful to watch, but it was also opening doors to conversations we'd never been able to have before. For the first time in my adult life, Patricia was asking questions about my choices rather than making assumptions about my limitations. "How did you learn to invest so young?" she asked during a long afternoon at her house, surrounded by financial documents she was finally ready to examine with fresh eyes. "I've been putting money in savings accounts my whole life, earning practically nothing in interest, while you were building wealth through strategies I didn't even know existed." These conversations became a bridge to understanding Elena's legacy in ways that went beyond the financial inheritance. I began sharing the lessons Elena had taught me during those Sunday kitchen table sessions, explaining how her business philosophy had shaped not just my financial strategy but my entire approach to life. "Grandma Elena saw money as freedom," I explained, showing Patricia some of the investment research techniques Elena had taught me. "Not freedom to buy expensive things, but freedom to make choices based on what mattered to you rather than what you could afford." She understood that real security comes from building assets that work for you, not from earning a salary that you spend immediately. Patricia was a remarkably quick student once she abandoned her preconceptions about how wealth should look. Within 3 months of the will reading, she had reorganized her own finances using principles Elena had been demonstrating for decades. She consolidated several underperforming accounts, began investing in index funds, and even started questioning some of the expensive lifestyle choices that had previously seemed essential to her identity. "I spent $40,000 last year on clothes I barely wear," she admitted during one of our weekly financial planning sessions. "I was so focused on looking successful that I forgot to think about actually being financially secure." No wonder Grandma Elena thought I didn't understand money. The family's response to my newfound wealth revealed interesting truths about human nature and family dynamics. Some relatives, particularly my cousins who had received smaller inheritances, initially seemed resentful about the dramatic disparity in Elena's bequests. During Thanksgiving dinner that year, there were pointed comments about how some people get all the luck and whispered conversations about whether Elena's decisions had been entirely fair, but these tensions were largely resolved when I began implementing Elena's suggestion about involving family members in the business operations. Rather than hoarding the grocery store chain as a personal asset, I restructured it as a family enterprise that provided meaningful roles for relatives who demonstrated genuine interest in learning Elena's business principles. My cousin Miguel, who had been working in middle management at a corporate chain, became the operations manager for our stores after proving himself capable of understanding Elena's customer-focused philosophy. My Aunt Carmen, who had always been good with people, took over human resources and employee training programs. Even Patricia found a role as the liaison between our stores and local community organizations, work that utilized her social connections while serving Elena's commitment to supporting the neighborhoods where our stores operated. The transformation of the business became a practical laboratory for testing Elena's theories about wealth and character. Family members who approached their roles with genuine commitment and Elena's customer-first mentality thrived in their positions and shared in the growing profits. Those who expected inherited wealth to come without responsibility gradually moved on to other opportunities. My own life changed in ways that were both dramatic and surprisingly subtle. Having nearly $9 million certainly provided security I'd never imagined possible, but Elena's lessons about lifestyle choices remained central to how I approached this new wealth. I continued living in my renovated apartment, driving practical vehicles, and shopping thoughtfully rather than extravagantly. The biggest change was in the scope of my environmental work. With financial independence secured, I was able to expand my consulting business into areas that were personally meaningful rather than just profitable. I established a nonprofit foundation focused on helping small farmers transition to sustainable practices, funding research projects that might not attract commercial investment but could have significant environmental impact. The foundation work was exactly the kind of purposeful activity Elena had encouraged, using money as a tool to create positive change rather than simply accumulating wealth for its own sake. Within 2 years, our grants had helped establish organic farming cooperatives in 3 counties, funded the development of drought-resistant crop varieties, and supported educational programs that taught sustainable agriculture techniques to the next generation of farmers. Patricia became one of my strongest supporters in this work, though her enthusiasm took some adjustment. During the Foundation's first board meeting, she arrived with elaborate presentation materials and suggestions for expensive promotional campaigns that completely missed the point of our grassroots approach. "Mom," I had to explain gently, "we're not trying to impress potential donors with fancy brochures. We're trying to use our resources efficiently to support farmers who need practical help." Elena would have preferred that we spend money on seeds and soil testing rather than marketing materials. But Patricia learned quickly, and her social connections proved valuable in unexpected ways. Her network of affluent friends became supporters of the foundation, not because of slick presentations, but because Patricia's genuine enthusiasm about our work was contagious. She began hosting informal educational events at her house, bringing together wealthy suburbanites and working farmers in conversations that broke down assumptions on both sides. The transformation in our family's understanding of wealth had ripple effects that extended beyond immediate financial decisions. The revelation about Elena's hidden millions and my own accumulated assets forced everyone to reconsider their assumptions about other aspects of life. If Patricia could be so wrong about something as basic as her daughter's financial situation, what other assumptions might be equally unfounded? This questioning led to more honest conversations about dreams deferred, talents undervalued, and opportunities missed because of preconceptions about what was possible or practical. My cousin Sandra, inspired by my entrepreneurial success, finally pursued her long-abandoned dream of opening a bakery, using her inheritance from Elena as startup capital. My uncle Robert, who had spent decades in insurance sales while secretly wanting to teach, used his bequest to fund a career transition into substitute teaching that eventually led to a full-time position. The will reading had revealed more than hidden wealth. It had demonstrated the power of looking beyond appearances to understand what people were actually capable of achieving. Elena's legacy wasn't just financial, it was a lesson about the importance of seeing people clearly rather than through the filter of our own assumptions and prejudices. 3 years after Elena's death, our family gathered for what had become an annual memorial dinner at the restaurant where Elena used to celebrate special occasions. The gathering was different from our previous family events in ways that reflected how much everyone had changed. Patricia arrived wearing a simple dress rather than designer clothes, carrying a homemade dessert instead of expensive store-bought contributions. She was excited to share updates about the Foundation's latest projects and eager to hear about everyone else's endeavors. The woman who had once measured success by the cost of handbags was now asking thoughtful questions about sustainable business practices and community impact. The conversation around the dinner table focused on meaningful work rather than material acquisitions. Family members shared stories about professional risks they'd taken, creative projects they'd pursued, and ways they were using Elena's financial gifts to build something lasting rather than simply spending their inheritance on temporary pleasures. During the memorial toast, Patricia stood up to address the family. 3 years ago, I thought I understood money, success, and what it meant to take care of the people you love. I was wrong about all of those things. Elena's greatest gift wasn't the financial inheritance she left us, it was forcing us to see past our assumptions to understand what was real. She looked directly at me, her eyes bright with unshed tears. I spent years trying to rescue a daughter who was already more successful than I ever imagined possible. I confused love with financial assistance, and wisdom with material display. Elena understood something I'm still learning, that real wealth comes from building something meaningful, not from buying something impressive. Patricia paused, collecting her thoughts before continuing. "Rebecca, I owe you an apology not just for misunderstanding your financial situation, but for underestimating your intelligence, your capabilities, and your judgment. You were building exactly the kind of life Elena would have admired, while I was worried that you weren't building the kind of life I thought you should want." The conversation that followed was the most honest our family had ever had about money, success, and the complex ways that love and financial support could become entangled. We talked about Elena's philosophy of living below your means while building assets, about the difference between appearing wealthy and being financially secure, and about how assumptions could blind us to the reality of other people's lives. As the evening wound down, I found myself reflecting on how completely my life had changed since that shocking afternoon in the lawyer's office. The financial inheritance had certainly transformed my circumstances, but the more profound change had been in my family's understanding of who I was and what I had accomplished. For years, I had lived with the frustration of being misunderstood by the people closest to me. Patricia's well-meaning attempts to help had felt like constant criticism of choices that were actually quite successful. The family's assumption that I needed their sympathy and support had been emotionally exhausting, creating a barrier between my real life and the life they imagined I was living. Elena's revelation had demolished those barriers, forcing everyone to see me as I actually was rather than as they had assumed me to be. But more importantly, it had taught all of us about the dangers of making assumptions about other people's lives based on limited information and personal prejudices. The lessons extended far beyond our family dynamics. In my work with the foundation, I encountered farmers who were dismissed as backwards by people who didn't understand their sophisticated knowledge of soil science and plant genetics. I met nonprofit workers who were assumed to be financially naive simply because they chose meaningful work over maximum salaries. I worked with investors who lived modestly despite substantial wealth, and with entrepreneurs who built successful businesses using principles that seemed unconventional to traditional business education. Elena's legacy had taught me to look past appearances to understand what people were actually accomplishing, to question assumptions about success and failure, and to recognize that wisdom often comes disguised as simplicity. As I drove home from the memorial dinner, I thought about Elena's final gift, not the money, though that had certainly been transformative, but the lesson about seeing clearly. She had spent years watching our family operate under false assumptions, and she had crafted a revelation that would force us all to confront the difference between what we thought we knew and what was actually true. The will reading had been shocking in the moment, but its deeper impact had been to teach us all about the importance of understanding people as they really are, rather than as we assume them to be. In a world full of people making judgments based on incomplete information, Elena had shown us the value of looking deeper, asking better questions, and remaining open to the possibility that our assumptions might be completely wrong. That was her true inheritance, not just the financial security she had built and shared, but the wisdom to see past surfaces to understand what was real. It was a lesson that continued to shape my decisions, my relationships, and my understanding of what it truly meant to be successful in life. 5 years after the will reading, our family's transformation had become so complete that newcomers to our circle often struggled to understand our dynamics. The traditional roles had been permanently altered. Patricia now came to me for financial advice, family members sought my input on business decisions, and relatives who had once pitied my struggles now referenced my success story when encouraging their own children to pursue unconventional paths. The grocery store chain had evolved into something Elena would have been proud of, expanding not through aggressive acquisition but through careful community engagement. We opened 2 new locations, but only after extensive research into neighborhoods that were underserved by quality food retailers. Each new store was designed around Elena's philosophy of understanding and serving the specific needs of its community rather than imposing a one-size-fits-all corporate model. The Woodland store, which had been Elena's first major expansion, became our testing ground for innovative programs that combined business success with community benefit. We established a partnership with local farms to sell produce directly to consumers, eliminating middleman costs while ensuring farmers received fair prices for their crops. The program was so successful that other grocery chains began requesting consultations about implementing similar initiatives. Patricia surprised everyone by becoming genuinely passionate about these community-focused business strategies. The woman who had once measured success purely by profit margins was now analyzing the social impact of our employment practices, vendor relationships, and customer service policies. She'd arrive at board meetings with detailed reports about how our stores were contributing to neighborhood economic development and community health outcomes. I finally understand what Elena meant about business being a form of community service, Patricia told me during one of our monthly strategy sessions. She wasn't just selling groceries, she was solving problems and building relationships. The profit was a result of doing good work, not the purpose of the work itself. This philosophical shift had ripple effects throughout Patricia's life. She began applying Elena's principles to her volunteer work, focusing on organizations that created systemic change rather than just providing temporary assistance. She joined the board of a microfinance organization that helped women start small businesses, bringing the same analytical approach she'd developed for our grocery operations to the challenge of supporting entrepreneurship in underserved communities. The Foundation work had expanded beyond my initial environmental focus to encompass broader issues of sustainable development and economic justice. We'd established partnerships with universities to fund research into climate-resilient agriculture, supported legal advocacy for farmworker rights, and created scholarship programs for students from rural communities who wanted to study environmental science or sustainable business practices. One of our most successful initiatives emerged from an unexpected source. Patricia's social connections had introduced us to wealthy families who owned large properties in California's wine country, many of whom were interested in converting portions of their land to more sustainable uses. Through the foundation, we developed a program that helped these landowners transition acreage from water-intensive ornamental landscaping to native habitat restoration or organic food production. The program was brilliant in its simplicity. Wealthy property owners received tax benefits and environmental credentials, the land was restored to ecological health, and local communities gained access to fresh food or preserved natural spaces. Elena would have appreciated how the initiative aligned different groups' interests to create outcomes that benefited everyone involved. My personal life had also evolved in ways that reflected Elena's teachings about the relationship between financial security and life choices. With the pressure of earning a living removed, I'd been able to pursue relationships and experiences based on genuine interest rather than practical considerations. I'd traveled to study permaculture techniques in Costa Rica, spent months working with indigenous communities in Mexico to document traditional farming practices, and collaborated with researchers in Europe on climate adaptation strategies. These experiences had led to an unexpected romantic relationship with Dr. James Chen, a soil scientist I'd met during a research project in Portugal. James shared Elena's appreciation for work that was both intellectually challenging and practically meaningful, and he understood my commitment to using wealth as a tool for positive change rather than personal luxury. Our wedding, planned for the following spring, would be held at Elena's original store in Sacramento, with the reception featuring food prepared by local restaurants that sourced ingredients from the farms we supported through the foundation. Patricia had initially suggested more elaborate venues, but she'd quickly embraced the symbolism of celebrating our union at the place where Elena had begun building her legacy. Elena would have loved James, Patricia said as we toured potential caterers who specialized in farm-to-table cuisine. He sees the world the way she did, understanding that everything is connected, that business and community and environment are all part of the same system. The upcoming wedding had prompted reflections about how to handle the intersection of significant wealth and personal relationships. James brought his own modest assets to our partnership, along with a successful academic career and research reputation, but the dramatic disparity in our financial situations required careful navigation. We decided to structure our finances in ways that honored both Elena's teachings about money and our commitment to maintaining individual autonomy. Through it all, the lessons from that shocking afternoon in the lawyer's office continued to resonate. The revelation had been so much more than a simple inheritance distribution, it had been a masterclass in the dangers of assumption and the importance of seeing people clearly. Elena had orchestrated a dramatic demonstration of how wrong we could be about the people closest to us, and the impact of that lesson continued to shape how I approached every relationship and every business decision. The extended family had internalized these lessons in their own ways. Cousin Sandra's Bakery had become a neighborhood institution, known not just for excellent pastries but for its role as a community gathering place where neighbors connected across economic and cultural divides. Uncle Robert had discovered a talent for teaching that surprised everyone, including himself, and was now being recruited by education programs throughout the region. Even relatives who had received smaller inheritances had found ways to use Elena's gifts strategically rather than simply spending them on immediate gratification. The will reading had somehow conveyed Elena's philosophy along with her financial assets, inspiring family members to think about money the way she had, as a tool for building security and creating positive change rather than as a means of displaying status. At family gatherings now, conversations centered around meaningful accomplishments rather than material acquisitions. People shared stories about students they'd helped, businesses they'd grown, communities they'd served, and innovations they'd developed. The competitive undercurrent that had once characterized our interactions had been replaced by genuine curiosity about each other's work and authentic celebration of each other's successes. Looking back, I realized that Elena's greatest gift hadn't been the financial inheritance, substantial as it was, but the forced examination of our family's assumptions and values. The will reading had been designed not just to distribute her wealth, but to challenge everyone to think more carefully about success, security, and the complex ways that money intersected with love and family relationships. As I prepared for the next chapter of my life, married to James and continuing to expand the foundation's impact, I carried forward Elena's most important lesson: the wisdom to look past appearances and assumptions to see what was actually true. In a world full of people making judgments based on incomplete information, that ability to see clearly remained Elena's most valuable legacy, worth more than all the millions she had accumulated and shared. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.